Hello, I'm Jerry Fort. Welcome to Jungle Jerry's Treehouse. Ready to do part 2 of Magic Treehouse number 24, Earthquake in the Early Morning by Mary Pope Osborne. Let's see, we are at chapter 6, Something to Lend. A woman in a blue bathrobe was sitting on a crumbling stone wall. She was sobbing into her handkerchief. 2 boys with dark hair sat next to the woman. The boys wore dusty, torn pajamas. They were both barefoot. The younger one was watching the older boy write on a rectangular piece of wood with a chunk of coal. Annie pulled Jack over to the family. "Hi, I'm Annie," she said. The 2 boys looked up. "I'm Peter," said the youngest. "He's my brother Andrew, and she's our Aunt Mary." He pointed to his brother, then to the woman as he spoke. Aunt Mary tried to smile through her tears. "Forgive me," she said. I'm a bit shaken up." "We are too," said Annie sympathetically. "The house caught fire," Peter said. "We escaped," said Andrew, "but we lost most of our things. We've lost our shoes," said Peter. Jack and Annie looked at the boys' bare feet. They were cut and bleeding. "Hey, my boots are just like boys' boots," Annie said. "One of you can wear them." "Take mine too," said Jack. He and Annie started unlacing their boots. "We can't just take your boots," said Andrew. Then we'll lend them to you," said Jack. He and Annie handed their boots to the 2 boys. Thank you," said Aunt Mary. She started crying again. The 2 boys put their new boots on. Then Peter whispered something to Andrew. Andrew held out the piece of wood to Jack and Annie. "Here's something we can lend you," he said. Jack and Annie read a poem the brothers had written on the piece of wood. "There is no water and still less soap. We have no city, but lots of hope." "Thanks," said Annie. "It's a great gift," said Jack. "We need some hope." "It's the only thing we can lend you," said Andrew. "Lend?" said Annie. She looked at Jack. "Oh, wow. They just gave us the special writing, something to lend." Jack smiled. They could go home now. "You should go to the Golden Gate Park. That's what a reporter told us," he said to the boys and their aunt. "Is that where you're going?" asked Aunt Mary. She had stopped crying at last and looked stronger. "We have to go home to our parents," said Annie. "Will you be safe?" asked the aunt. "Yes, once we're home, we'll be safe," said Jack. "Thanks for lending us your boots," said Peter. You're good friends," said Annie. "You've helped us more than you know," said Jack. "Be careful," said Aunt Mary. "We will," said Jack and Annie. They waved as their new friends headed off to the park. Jack sighed. "Ready?" he said. "Yeah," said Annie. "I guess we just go back the way we came." Jack looked down the street. Smoke billowed up from the bottom of the hill. "That might not be as easy as it sounds," he said. Channel 7. Dynamite. What's dynamite have to do with it? Isn't it bad enough there's earthquakes? Do we need dynamite exploding too? "We'd better be careful," said Annie. They stepped in their sock feet over the broken cobblestones, trying not to cut themselves. They headed down the hillside. On their way, they passed policemen carrying stretchers with injured people on them. They passed soldiers directing all those trying to escape the fires. One man was trying to push a piano down the street. Another man was wearing a bunch of hats, all piled on top of one another. A woman carried her 3 little dogs in a bag. Everyone's trying to save what's important to them, said Annie. Like the librarian, said Jack. And us. We're trying to save this sign. He clutched the piece of wood. When they were halfway down the hill, a soldier on a horse galloped in front of them. Get off the street. We're setting off dynamite, he shouted. Dynamite, said Jack. Yikes, said Annie. People started running in all directions. Jack and Annie looked around wildly for a safe place to go. Jack saw an alley. There, he said. Why are they shooting off? They're going to have to explain that to me. I don't know why they're setting off dynamite. And there's people probably still buried in rubble. I don't know if it's a good idea to set off dynamite and risk more stuff falling on top of people that might not be as buried as what they could be, but they shoot off dynamite. It might really cover them up. So I don't know. I don't understand that. I'll have to see what's going on. They ran into the alley and crouched on the ground. Jack reached into his bag for their research book. He looked in the index for the word dynamite. He found it. Then he turned to the right page number, and read, okay, here we go. After the fire started, the mayor had an idea. He thought that if some buildings were destroyed, the sparks would not fly from one wooden roof to the next. He ordered some buildings to be blown up by dynamite. His plan did not work. The firestorm raged from building to building, from street to street. I don't know. It didn't sound wise to me. I mean, I think they're trying to save fires from happening, but I guess they didn't have fire engines and fire trucks back then. Oh, let's read on. Firestorm, Jack thought. The word sounded terrible. Just as he put the book away, a huge blast of dynamite shook the ground. Dust and dirt flew everywhere, even down the alley. Jack clutched their sign with one hand. He covered his eyes with the other. Annie did the same. Another huge blast rocked the ground. Jack tasted grit in his mouth. He looked at Annie. She was caked with dust from head to toe. He looked down at himself. He was just as dirty as she was. Hey, would you look at those two? Someone said. Now that's a story. Jack looked up. Betty, the newspaper reporter, and Fred, the photographer, were standing in front of them. Even though they were also covered with dirt, Fred was setting up his camera, and Betty was taking notes in her notebook. Hold up your signs, Sonny, said Betty. Too stunned to say anything, Jack held up the sign with the poem about hope. Fred took a picture. Another dynamite blast shook the ground. Come with us, we're headed for the park, said Betty. We can't, we're on our way home to our parents, said Annie. Well, get going and be careful, said Betty. Let's beat it, Fred. The photographer grabbed his camera equipment, and the two of them rushed off. I don't think Betty and Fred recognized us, said Annie. I don't recognize us, said Jack. Another blast shook the ground. Come on, said Annie. Let's beat it. Jack and Annie jumped up. Jack put their sign in his bag. Then they started back down the hill. Chapter 8. Good luck, San Francisco. Jack and Annie ran over the cobblestones. Dynamite blast echoed behind them. They headed back down the hill. Flames shot across the roofs, traveling from one house to another. We're heading right into the firestorm, Jack shouted over the noise. We have to keep going, Annie shouted. Annie shouted back. We have to keep going, Annie shouted back, before the treehouse catches fire. At the bottom of the hill, thick smoke was rolling through the street. It made Jack's eyes burn. Where's the treehouse? He shouted. Here, said Annie. Jack followed her voice. She was holding on to the rope ladder. It's still here, Jack said with relief. Of course. The treehouse wouldn't leave without us, said Annie. Don't you go, said Jack. Annie started up the rope ladder. Jack followed. They climbed into the treehouse and looked out the window. All around, buildings were going up in flames. Black smoke seemed to be smothering the city. Jack could scarcely breathe. His throat burned. His eyes were stinging. Annie grabbed her Pennsylvania book. She opened it to the picture of Frog Creek and pointed. I wish we could go there, she said. Good luck, San Francisco. Goodbye, San Francisco, said Jack. The wind started to blow. The treehouse started to spin. It spun faster and faster. Then everything was still. Absolutely still. Chapter 9. The Wonderful Room. The songs of early morning birds filled the woods. Jack opened his eyes and sighed. They were back in Frog Creek. He could breathe again. Oh, excuse me. His eyes didn't sting anymore. He was wearing his own clothes, even his sneakers. I wonder what happened to everyone, Annie asked anxiously. Andrew, Peter, and their aunt, and Betty and Fred, and all the other people. Jack pulled out the research book. He turned to the last chapter. He read aloud. After the earthquake fires were put out, people from all over the world sent help to San Francisco. The brave citizens of the city never gave up hope. Many even wore badges that said, "Let's rebuild at once." In less than 10 years, San Francisco was once again one of the loveliest cities in the United States. Oh, good, breathed Annie. Hey, do you have our sign? Jack reached again into his pack. He pulled out the sign from Peter and Andrew. He placed it on the floor next to the list from the Civil War. Next to the list from the Civil War, the letter from the Revolutionary War, and the slate from the Pioneer Schoolhouse. We have all 4 writings now, he said. So what happens next, said Annie. Suddenly there was a roar. A bright light flashed through the treehouse. Jack covered his face. When he peeked over the tops of his fingers, he saw Morgan Le Fay. Morgan, Jack and Annie cried joyfully. They both hugged her. Morgan hugged them back. We found the 4 special writings for your library, said Jack. Annie picked up the list and the letter. Jack picked up the slate and the sign. Here they are, he said. They started to give everything to Morgan, but she held up her hand. Do not give them to me, she said. Someone else needs them more. Suddenly, a blinding light flashed through the treehouse again. There came a great roar, then silence. When Jack and Annie opened their eyes, they were no longer in the magic treehouse. They were standing in a huge, shadowy room. The room smelled wonderful, like leather, books, and a wood-burning fire. Flames crackled in a huge stone hearth. Hearth. Along the walls were rows and rows of tall bookcases filled with books. Welcome to my library, Morgan said softly. Wow, whispered Jack. Someone here is waiting to meet you, said Morgan. I told him that 2 special messengers would soon arrive. Where is he? Asked Annie. Morgan pointed to a man dressed in dark blue in a corner of the library. He sat in a chair. His head was bowed. His hair was black, streaked with silver. He looked tired, Annie whispered. Yes, he and his knights have been defeated, Morgan said quietly. He has given up all hope for his kingdom. How can we help? asked Annie. Morgan looked down at the special writings that Jack and Annie held. Would it help if we showed him these? Jack asked. Morgan smiled. Come on, let's show him, said Annie. They crossed the room and knelt before the tired-looking man. Excuse me, Annie said. The man looked up. He had sad gray eyes. We're Morgan's messengers. We've come to help, said Jack. The man shook his head. I don't understand, he said in a deep, tired voice. You are children. How can you help? Sometimes children can help a lot, said Annie. Jack and I have helped a general, and we helped wounded soldiers. We helped people caught in an earthquake and a twister, Jack added. The man straightened up a little. That is brave, he said. We want to share how we did it, said Annie. She held up a list from the Civil War. This tells you how to help wounded. This tells you how to help wounded people, she said. She held up a letter from the Revolutionary War. And this tells you that even when things look their worst, you shouldn't give up, she said. Jack held up the slate from the Pioneer Schoolhouse. This says, if at first you don't succeed, try again, he said. Then Jack held up the piece of wood from the San Francisco earthquake. And this says that when you've lost everything, you can still have hope, he said. The man studied the 4 special writings. Then he looked at Jack and Annie with piercing gray eyes. You were both very... Oh, gosh. Sorry. Didn't sleep good last night. You were both very kind to find all these things and bring them to me, he said. Are you magic? Oh, no, said Annie. Morgan is magic. We're just ordinary kids. The man smiled. He seemed less sad and weary now. And I am just an ordinary king, he said softly. I suppose if two ordinary... Gosh, why am I keep yawning? He said, I suppose if 2 ordinary kids can find courage and hope, then an ordinary king can find it too. The man slowly stood up. I will go now and speak to my knights, he said. I will share the wisdom you have brought me. He wrapped his cape around him. He bowed to Jack and Annie. Thank you, he said. Then he strode bravely out of Morgan's library. I feel another one coming on. Oh, gosh. Wow, maybe I should take a nap after I read this book. Then he strode bravely out of Morgan's library. Yes, thank you, said Morgan, walking over to Jack and Annie. You are very welcome, they said. These are for your library, said Jack. He and Annie gave Morgan the 4 special writings. Morgan smiled. Their wisdom will help many readers who come here, she said. Great, said Annie. It's time for you 2 to go home now, said Morgan. Jack looked around Morgan's library. He hated to leave. It was the most wonderful room he'd ever seen. Don't worry, you can come back, said Morgan, reading his mind. You must come back. You must come back, for you both have helped save Camelot. Goodbye for now. Before Jack or Annie could speak, there was another blinding flash. Then they were home again, in the treehouse in Frog Creek in the early morning. Chapter 10. The Mystery of Morgan's Library. We're going to get to know the mystery behind it? I can't believe we took a trip to Morgan's library, said Annie. Jack smiled and nodded. It was incredible, wasn't it? Said Annie. Yeah, said Jack. A strong breeze gusted through the treehouse. It blew open their research book about San Francisco. Annie reached for the book. Jack, she said, look at this. She pointed to a photograph in the research book. It showed a boy and a girl covered with dirt. The boy held a sign. It was the poem about hope. Annie read the caption aloud. After the earthquake, while fires raged through the city, 2 brave children tried to give hope to others. There is no water and still less soap. We have no city, but lots of hope. Get that one out of the way. Annie laughed. Those brave children are us, she said. That's the picture Fred took of us before we left San Francisco. Jack laughed and shook his head with amazement. Annie closed the book. I guess we are 2 brave kids who try to give hope, she said. We just gave some to King Arthur, didn't we?" "King Arthur," said Jack. "Yeah," said Annie. "She started down the rope ladder. That was the mystery of Morgan's library. We had to give 4 special writings to King Arthur so he could get his hope and courage back and save Camelot." "That wasn't King Arthur," said Jack. He threw on his pack and followed Annie. "Sure it was," said Annie, stepping onto the ground. "Didn't you hear him say, 'I'm just an ordinary king'? Get it? King. But King Arthur's not an ordinary king," said Jack. "Well, he thinks so," said Annie. "I know it was him. I feel it." She smiled, then she started through the Frog Creek woods. Jack stared after her. "King Arthur?" As birdsong filled the early morning woods, Jack thought about their visit to Morgan's library. He remembered the sad king and how their writings seemed to give him strength. Maybe Annie was right. Maybe they really had helped King Arthur save Camelot. And maybe someday they would go back. "Hurry, Jack," Annie called, "before Mom and Dad wake up." "Coming," Jack shouted, and he took off after her, running for home finally. All right. Facts about earthquakes. Want to hear more about earthquakes? An earthquake is caused by a sudden shifting of the rocky plates that make up the Earth's surface. When the plates pull apart, push together, or slide past one another, the movement causes shock waves. The place where the plates of the Earth meet is called a fault. One of these faults, the San Andreas Fault, runs almost all the way through California. Every year, millions of earthquakes occur around the world where plates come together, but most are too small to be felt. The study of earthquakes is called seismology. A person who studies earthquakes is called a seismologist. Seismographs are instruments that detect the motion of earthquake waves. Since the big earthquake in 1906, Californians have become better prepared for earthquakes. New buildings are built to strict building codes that make them more earthquake-proof. Fire and police departments and emergency services are better able to handle earthquake problems. Citizens are better educated about how to protect themselves from earthquake hazards. Many households have prepared earthquake survival kits and keep emergency supplies on hand. It's all good ideas. In a Magic Treehouse book, true facts are often worked into the story. Some of the true facts about the 1906 San Francisco earthquake in this book are: a banker named Charles Crocker saved his bank's money by sending wagon loads of money down to the bay. So these are true facts. A private library called the Sutro Library contained up to 200,000 books. The books were destroyed after they were moved from the Montgomery Building to Mechanics Pavilion, which burned down. The words on the sign that Peter and Andrew lent to Jack and Annie were written on a sign tacked to a crumbling building on Market Street. There you go. Wow. Interesting. That was a fun little story. Earthquake in the early morning. Did y'all enjoy that? You want to see what our next one is? Magic Treehouse number 25. Stage fright on a summer night. All right. See what that's about. Looks like William Shakespeare, maybe. And they're doing a poem or doing a play or something. To find out. All right, yeah. Thanks for watching. Appreciate it. We'll see you on the next one. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Bye.